Alrighty, guys, and just like that, we are back with a new installment on my podcast series. Now, before we get into this podcast, I wanted to address a couple of things. Just before we start here, some quick things. I apologize for not making a podcast last week, detailing the things over week 6. Especially with some wins. I know Florida had a big win. That was the main one, really. No one expected Michigan State to beat Ohio State. We all knew what was going to happen there. The only question, the Michigan State-Ohio State game was, would Michigan State be able to hold Ohio State under 100 yards rushing? And we found out pretty quick that wasn't going to happen. And because Michigan State didn't have any offense. That's for later topic. That's for later discussion. That's a completely different podcast episode. But in general, I apologize for not making one last week. In RCA, we had a ton of tests and quizzes. I think I had 5 tests last week. Now, I know that's not the same for everyone because different electives and different classes. So some people take AP Spanish, some people take AP Psychology, and that just depends on what class you're in. But in general, we had multiple tests last week, and when you have that many tests on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, it's just tough to make a podcast because for the Monday test, I'm studying on Sunday, which is usually when I record these episodes after I get home from youth group, and then Monday night I wanted to do it. But I had to study for Tuesday's test, and then Tuesday night I had to study for Wednesday's test, and then Wednesday night I actually flew down to see my grandparents in Florida for fall break there. So I was in the plane, and obviously we arrived in Miami around 10 or so at night, a little bit later than that. I think it was 10:30 at night, and we drove north and west to a small town called LaBelle and spent a couple days with them. Spent Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then this morning on Sunday we flew back into Raleigh. So I apologize for not making one. I mean, I was just dead tired coming off the plane. Thursday, Friday, and Saturday never had any chances to make anything. And obviously, once you get to Saturday, there's no point in making a podcast detailing last week's because we have this week's games to analyze and look at and see what teams are doing. Because if this week will be the symbolic, the symbol of college football to prove to you that anything can happen in any week. I think we had 7 ranked teams go down this weekend to unranked teams, or to lower ranked teams. So anything can happen in college football, and I will prove it to you here. So in this podcast, we are going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about Georgia, Florida, the AP poll in general, Wisconsin, Alabama, LSU, Clemson, and Ohio State. We will get into all of those things. I'm going to make a couple of bold claims. I'm going to try to explain why I make those bold claims, and then we will talk about what this week shows for the landscape of college football and what we can predict or project or think what will happen in the future coming up, because we got some massive matchups coming up in just a few weeks. Wisconsin, Ohio State playing 2 weeks. I'll make sure to touch on that in this podcast. Alabama, LSU still got to play each other. Georgia's going to play Florida, and we'll talk about why the Georgia-Florida game is still an important game for the landscape of college football, not just for both teams. So let's get into it here. I'm going to start out. I have moved up in the technological department. I used to write down a simple outline of what I wanted to talk about on paper. But now I have a charger, a long charging cord, about 10 feet long. It's a long cord. I mean, you buy it in the package. It's such a small package, you never think of it being that big of a cord. But in reality, I mean, the package isn't even bigger than a 3x5 note card. And for those of you who use the note card in the Bible test, you know what I'm talking about. It's not that big of an object, just in general. But you straighten out that cord now. That is a big cord, especially when you buy the 10-foot one, which I was very happy I was able to get that one, because they had the 6-foot one for, I think it was $20, but you could get the 10-foot one for like $22. So if we're looking at unit rate there, price per foot of charging cable, you got to go with the 10-foot one. That's a no-brainer right there. And it wasn't even on sale. I think Target's the one who does that. Obviously, Amazon probably has a better deal, just because Amazon, you can get it directly from there. But that's for a different discussion. Perhaps we can talk about that in class or something of that nature. I know a lot of my viewers or listeners are students who go to my school and are in my grade and know me. But for those of you watching, maybe are out of school or are done with school and have no idea what I'm talking about when I'm talking about these classes, thank you for listening as well. And I hope you are listening while driving to work or something of that nature, or making something, doing something productive in life, obviously, as we go throughout our days. But let's jump into this podcast here, the new episode, without any further ado. So let's talk about Georgia first. Now, Georgia is going to strike up a big controversy because of their loss to South Carolina. Now, is it a bad loss? Yes, it's a terrible loss. Is there any explanation for why they should have lost? No, absolutely not. South Carolina is a 3-loss team, a 2-win team, and playing with their their third string quarterback, or a quarterback who was listed as third string in the spring, and not to mention he was on one leg. Their backup quarterback obviously was on one leg, and he got hurt, and they put in the third string, and that third string wasn't that great, but he wasn't that bad. It was more of a runaround type quarterback, which I guess posed a little bit of more of a problem to Georgia, because if you follow Georgia the last couple of years, they seem to have a big problem with backup quarterbacks. Might want to look into that. It seems like Georgia, I mean, you look at the SEC championship game from 2018, obviously the national championship game from 2017, you put in a backup quarterback, and then the Georgia defense looks like they've never seen this guy before, and they look like they're running around like a chicken with their head cut off, which is not a recipe for success whatsoever. So, as we look into Georgia, Georgia's spot in where they're located right now and what they've had happen is not uncommon. This happens all the time in college football. It happened in 2016 when Clemson lost to Pitt at home. It happened in 2015 when Ohio State lost to Virginia Tech at home. It happened in 2016 when Ohio State lost to Ole Miss at home, or Alabama lost to Ole Miss at home. And it happened in 2017. Who lost in 2017 at home? Actually, I know there wasn't the team, because Alabama won, but they lost on the road at Auburn. Yeah, but again, that's another loss. These losses in the regular season happen all the time in college football, and it goes back to the commonality here of anything can happen at any given day, and anyone can lose to any certain team. As Mac Brown said it, we talked about it in the previous podcast. He said it in the pregame speech to the Carolina team. He goes, "It's not the best team. It's the team that plays best that day," and that is 100% true. It is not who the best team is, because if there's a reason why they play the game. If these games could just be decided on paper, our season would be done in probably 2 hours, and we would just look back on it. But they don't. That doesn't happen. They play the game for a reason. Just as Herm Edwards would say, "Hello, you play to win the game." So, you are playing to win the game. We play the game for a reason. These games are not decided on paper. And if Georgia needs to be the example to prove that to you, so be Georgia will be the example. So, we'll use them. Okay? So, as I said earlier, this is not a unfamiliar territory in college football to have. Georgia still has a great chance to make the playoff. And you might say, well, how in the world can Georgia possibly still make the playoff after a horrendous loss, which it is. It's a bad loss no matter which way you slice it, cut it, or anything of that nature. Dice it if you want to go that far. Make it into picometers, something really small. 1 times 10 to the 9th in 1 meter. For those of you in AP chemistry, you will know these things. But yes, Georgia, you have to remember, Georgia's still going to go through Florida. They can still run through the East. They can still win the East. Okay, let's not act like South Carolina's going undefeated the rest of the year and going to beat Georgia and have the tiebreaker with Georgia to go to Atlanta and get slaughtered by Alabama. That's not going to happen. Okay, Georgia, if they win out, they can definitely go to the SEC championship game, have no problem whatsoever. And if they beat Alabama and win the SEC championship game, they are in the playoff. The SEC champion, no matter how many losses it has, will make the playoff regardless of what happens. It's going to happen that way. If Georgia wins out, they're in the playoff. Now, do I expect Georgia to win out? No. Do I think Georgia will make the SEC championship game? I'm 50-50 right now, and I'll touch on that when I talk about Florida, because Florida is a team that I wrote off after the first week of the season, and I talked about this a lot in the previous podcast. Florida looked awful against Miami. Absolutely awful. It looked like a bunch of guys who had never played football before and wanted to just rustle and tussle and hit the opponent as hard as they could. And they didn't care what they had to do or what means they had to go to accomplish that. They didn't care. And it looked bad coaching, was bad talent. Felipe Franks looked like looked like a middle schooler with an attitude problem. He couldn't get his head straight, and he would be shrugging his shoulders and dancing when he scored. But then when he messed up, he looked terrible and he looked mad at himself. And just, it was a bad game for Florida all around. Miami should have won that game. And if you've watched any Miami football this year, Miami is awful, absolutely awful. I mean, they're worse than Virginia Tech, and Virginia Tech is 30 points worse than Duke. Okay, this is not basketball. Basketball season has not started yet, and Virginia Tech is 30 points worse than Duke. Yes, I know Duke is better with Coach Cutcliffe, okay? But Duke's ceiling, if we're being realistic, is 7 wins, okay? You're going to tell me that Miami is worse than a team that is 30 points worse than a team that has a ceiling of 7 wins? I mean, come on now. That's just awful. But we're getting off track, and let's get back on track. Because we look at this, as I said earlier, Georgia still has a great chance to make the playoff. I don't think that'll happen. I don't think they can beat Alabama right now. If you want to get some more analysis on why I don't think Georgia could beat Alabama, my views are pretty much synonymous with Uncle Lou's views. If you type in Uncle Lou on YouTube, he talked a lot about this in the video he made today, which is Sunday, and you can get more analysis on that. But Georgia still has a great chance, and I'll talk about why when I talk about Florida. So let's talk about Florida. Florida, as I said earlier, I'm going through the outlet here. It says to admit I was wrong, which I was. I wrote off Florida after week 0, and Florida is a better team than I thought they were going to be. They responded. They played in a really, really hostile environment in LSU in Tiger Stadium on Saturday night, which I really don't think maybe a handful of teams. I think Alabama could win in Tiger Stadium. I think Clemson could win in Tiger Stadium. I think maybe Ohio State could win in Tiger Stadium, and that would be about it. In Ohio State, I'm a little bit iffy on because Ohio State does not play well in big atmospheres. Clemson and Alabama, regardless of what you want to think about Clemson, and you could say, well, that's homerism because I'm a Clemson fan, which I am, and I'm not ashamed to admit it at all. Regardless of what you want to say about those, Clemson and Alabama have played in the most hostile environments in the biggest games over the last few years, and they have handled all of them very, very well. National championship games against each other. Alabama, of course, plays LSU in Tiger Stadium every other year. Clemson has to go to Tallahassee, which in the previous years has been a lot more intimidating, but still in a general sense, Tallahassee is not an easy place to play. Obviously the playoff games and stuff of that nature, kind of like what Jalen Hurts was saying when they were asking him about the Red River rivalry today. Try and saying that one 10 times fast. That's a little of a tongue twister there. I just discovered that. Would you look at that? But when they were asking Jalen Hurts about the Red River rivalry game and what he thought about it, he was like, I played in the Iron Bowl and I played in the national championship games, and so I think I'm all right. And that made the people in Texas very, very mad because the people in Texas have a lot of pride in Texas football, and they think that everything that Texas football touches is the greatest thing on earth, kind of like the Midas touch, which is an AP literature reference. So for those of you who are in AP literature, you will know what I'm talking about there. But still, so the Texas fans went nuts, but if you really think about it, is he wrong to say that? He's played in national championship games. He's played in SEC championship games. He's played in front of packed houses. He played in Alabama LSU games. He's played in Alabama Texas A&M games. He's played in all these really hostile environments, and yet he has remained aplomb during those games. And so it shouldn't shock you of his response, especially because he is not at Oklahoma for Oklahoma. He's at Oklahoma for one singular purpose, and that is it. That is to get better as a passer and go to the NFL. That is the only reason why he is at Oklahoma right now. And it's the same thing for Kelly Bryant at Mizzou. Kelly Bryant is at Missouri for one reason. It is not for Missouri, okay? No one wants to be at Missouri. Missouri has dorm rooms that are vacated right now. There's no one there because there's not enough students there. So if you want to go to Missouri, you can relive your college glory days and stay at a dorm room at Missouri on campus. So any of y'all who want to go to Missouri and go in a Missouri football game in the near future, you might want to think about that as like a cheap housing alternative, as I know traveling costs can get quite expensive in these hotels. Like the hotel in Clemson, there's a Courtyard by Marriott in Clemson that's on the outskirts of downtown. It's on 123 when you drive in. During the off season, non-football season, I think it's $90 a night. Football season, they ramp it up to $500 a night in Clemson, South Carolina. So you can tell where during the season in these big towns where you got over 100,000 people coming in to these venues, where they can mark up the prices because the demand is there. They can mark up the prices. Those of you in honors economics will understand that. You have a market equilibrium point, so you have this supply, and they only have this much amount of supply. We only have this many rooms for these people, but this demand is exceedingly high. So because of that, the market equilibrium price goes up. Therefore, your prices can rise without creating a surplus, which is the worst thing you can do in economics. You do not want to create a surplus. And there are many solutions to creating surplus, but we will not go into those for the purposes of this because none of y'all are interested in economics right now. Y'all are clicking on my podcast to learn about football, okay? So as you look at Florida, they're a better team than I thought about this, but where do they go from here, okay? So they got to play at South Carolina this weekend, which is going to be a hostile environment. I hate South Carolina. I don't like anything about South Carolina. I think everything that they stand for is bad, except for their quarterback, who is obviously the brother of the guy who committed suicide in Washington State. That's a very tough subject to talk about. I'm not going to talk or touch on that right now because I don't want to say something that could come back to bite me a later time. But in general, I don't like South Carolina. I don't like their fans. I don't like what the program stands for and everything of that nature. But regardless of what you want to say about that, Willie Bryce Stadium is a hostile environment to play. It is not an easy place to play at, and so Florida's got to go there. I think that game's at noon though, which makes it better for Florida because that way the fans won't have as much time to, I mean, if we're being real here, get drunk in the parking lot. I know that's probably not the most politically correct thing to say, but I mean it's not exactly wrong. It's pretty factual. But so it's better for Florida to play at noon against a South Carolina team that, if we're being honest, will probably have somewhat of a hangover from the Georgia game. I mean, you were talking about a team in South Carolina that's had their biggest win in years over Georgia, a number 3 Georgia team. And by the way, that would be the biggest win in years for almost any team in the country. That's a huge deal to beat Georgia on the road in Sanford Stadium, which is, I mean, if we're talking about hostile environments, Sanford Stadium's up there towards the top. It affected Notre Dame. Notre Dame could have won that game, but they had a coaching staff who couldn't get the play calls in and couldn't get everything straightened out in this really hostile environment. And the environment played, and the crowd played a huge factor in that Georgia Notre Dame game, which is starting to lose a lot of significance now, being that Georgia lost. And Notre Dame, let's be real here, Notre Dame is not making a playoff unless they go undefeated. I don't care what happens with the Power 5. I don't care what happens with the Group of 5. Notre Dame avoids a conference championship game. They avoid a 13th game every single year. And that costs them in terms of their margin for error. They have zero margin for error. If they lose a game, they're done. Unless you have a major catastrophe. But that, I mean, you would have to have such a big catastrophe that it's just almost impractical at this point to think of that, especially with all the good teams around college football coming up. Last couple of years has been Alabama and Clemson and everyone else. This year it's not that way, which is good for college football. But after that, they play at South Carolina and then they play Georgia. Now, I think they get Georgia at home this year, but again, you have to remember, the Georgia-Florida game is played in Jacksonville. It's played at the Jaguar Stadium. So the home field advantage isn't anything because they're not playing in Gainesville or they're not playing in Athens. Okay, but that's a huge game. And here's why it's a huge game. Because if Georgia wants to make the playoff, this is where it starts. Georgia has to win this game, okay? They have to beat Florida and they have to move on. They have to win out, obviously. And if Florida wants to make the playoff, Florida has to win this game. This is a big game for Florida to win as far as confidence booster and trying to go in and trying to secure the East and try to play Alabama and somehow give them a run for their money. I don't think that would happen in any way, shape, or form. But if Florida wants to do that and Florida wants to have a chance to get to the playoff, that's what Florida has to do. So we have a big game in Jacksonville in a couple weeks. It'll be very interesting to see what Georgia and Florida are looking at there. I think that could be very much a rock fight where it's just two low-scoring offenses with great defenses, but we'll analyze that some more in the next podcast, which will be recorded on Sunday after all of the Week 8 games. Okay, now I want to talk about something as I keep moving down on the outlet or not the outlet, the outline, excuse me, as we keep moving down here, I want to talk about the AP poll. AP poll got released earlier today, and it was Alabama, LSU, Clemson, and I want to say Ohio State in the top 4, which is fine. And I can make an argument for all of those teams, and if you want to switch those teams, that's fine too. But the one thing I want to address here is this. There's a couple things. First of all, we have to take these AP poll reactions with a grain of salt, because in reality, the AP poll doesn't matter. The only rankings that will matter are around Halloween. I think it's the first week in November, and those are the college football playoff rankings selected by the committee of 13 members, and they select the rankings. And at the end, first week in December, after the conference championship games, the college football playoff will be announced. In reality, if your team's in the college football playoff, it won't matter what their AP poll ranking was in September and October. You will just be happy they're in the college football playoff. But I do want to say this. I find it a little surprising that the voters would put LSU ahead of Clemson and not ahead of Alabama, because the logic behind them putting LSU in front of Clemson is that LSU has looked better to this point, which, if I'm being honest, they absolutely have. Yes, I'm a Clemson fan, but I'm also a college football fan. I'm going to be honest when I can. I'm going to be as practical and as logical as possible. LSU has looked like the second best team in the nation so far, behind Ohio State. And if you want to make an argument for 1 and 2 between there, you can make an argument for either team to be number 1 right now, especially with LSU having the win over number 7 Florida this weekend. But I find it weird, or I find an inconsistency in the logic. If you're going to say that LSU is the better team than Clemson, and therefore we're not going to put the more impressive team over Clemson, therefore we're going to put them in front of Clemson, why can you not say the same thing about Alabama? What has Alabama done that makes them look so much more impressive than LSU? They have a win over Duke. They beat South Carolina, which is looking like a better win now. They beat A&M. Those are the 3 biggest wins right now. Where is the logic? Are they just looking better? Are they just running up the score and you're just looking at box scores, AP poll members? Like, is that what you're looking for? Because if it is, you're doing a disservice to all of us who are looking at your rankings and trying to find validation in your rankings. Because in reality, if you're just going to check box scores every single day, and that's the only way you can judge teams, you're doing it wrong. You have to watch the games. The games, the way teams play, or what determined how we should vote on them. I mean, if you remember, Clemson played Syracuse in week 3, and Clemson did not look that great. But Trevor Lawrence had a career high in passing yards, so if you're going to look at that and say, oh, wow, Trevor Lawrence has a career high in passing yards, Clemson must have, we did blow out Syracuse, so that's right. But you would say, if you were watching the game, Clemson did not look at his peak performance. And by the way, I don't think they looked at their peak performance against Florida State this weekend. I think there were glimpses of that, but I don't think it was for the full 60 minutes. But I'll get to that in a second. So I find an inconsistency in the logic here, and that's fine. Obviously, these rankings don't matter, so I don't really care what they come out. I find it weird that they would say that LSU is more impressive than Clemson, which they have been, but not more impressive than Alabama. But perhaps this could be saying that LSU hasn't beaten Alabama since Jack and Jill actually went up the hill or cracked corn, depending on which one you would like to go with in terms of that. And so maybe that's why they're holding out on LSU. We're already at 23 minutes here. Goodness gracious. Or actually past, we're almost at 24 minutes. My chemistry teacher wanted me to limit this to 10, but I guess I got a little carried away there. The introduction was a little bit too long, but hopefully y'all are liking this, and hopefully y'all are liking what we're talking about now, and we can keep rolling on. So let's keep moving on here, okay? Let's talk about Wisconsin. We're just keep moving down the outline here. Wisconsin, again, had a great win this weekend over Michigan State, winning 38-0. Wisconsin's defense is legit. to have a shutout against Michigan State and all their shutouts, I think that's their third shutout this year. It is hard to shut someone out. It really is. To hold a team to 0 points is one of the hardest things you could do. It means you have to play flawless for 60 minutes of the game. That's what it means. And Wisconsin's defense is playing that, okay? And we're going to find out really the true test of Wisconsin's defense. This is going to be the hardest test all year, is when Ohio State comes to town in 2 weeks. I believe they come to town. I'm almost positive that Wisconsin gets Ohio State at home. I'm almost positive. I'm going to look that up right now. But if they do, either way, you have a chance for that to happen. Either way, regardless of the score of that game, you have a chance to see Ohio State and Wisconsin play each other 2 times this year, obviously, because Wisconsin is by far the best team in the Big Ten West. Okay, I was wrong. The game is in Columbus this year. Okay, that makes it a little bit more difficult. But Wisconsin is by far the best team in the Big Ten West this year, and Ohio State is by far the best team in the Big Ten East. Don't even try to tell me about how Penn State is this good team and may pose a challenge. Don't say that. That just makes you sound ignorant. Okay, Penn State, yes, they're undefeated, but if you watch Penn State play, do they look like a really good team to you? No, they don't. Okay, they do not look like a great team right now. They may not even be undefeated. I think they are, but they may not be. I'm almost positive they are, though. Okay, so Wisconsin, their season's really going to come down, or a big turning point in their season is going to come down in a couple of weeks when they have to go to Columbus and play Ohio State. And if they can win that game, you better watch out, because Wisconsin is going to the playoff if they win that game. As long as they win in the Big Ten championship game and become Big Ten champions, Wisconsin is getting in the playoff. And I think that will be a very tough challenge for whoever's playing Wisconsin first, because Wisconsin's defense, no matter what team they are, Wisconsin's defense is shutting down the run. And if you don't have a quarterback that can throw the ball downfield consistently and can beat you downfield with the passing game, i.e. Oklahoma, that's who I'm targeting there. Yes, Jalen Hurts is a good quarterback. Is Jalen Hurts a guy who I would put confidence in to throw the ball 50 times down the field for passes of 15 yards or more? Absolutely not. I would not put any faith in that whatsoever, and any validation to that point can be seen in the multiple title games that he has played in and the SEC championship game of last year. The man cannot consistently throw the ball downfield of 15 yards or more. So I would be worried about Oklahoma from that standpoint. In addition to that, Wisconsin has a really good running back in Jonathan Taylor, and they're going to run the ball down your throat every single game. That's their bread and butter. They're going to run the ball 2 straight times on first and second down, and they're going to try to dink it or dump the pass into the flat to a tight end, a big tight end, and try to pick up the first down, and then they're going to keep going and do the same thing again. Okay, so Wisconsin has a chance for a major turning point in their season coming up in a couple weeks at Columbus against Ohio State, but we'll see. We'll talk more about that in the upcoming podcast. Alabama obviously had the good win against Texas A&M in College Station this weekend. Alabama is a really good team. I'm not going to say they're not. Alabama is a very, very good team, and I would hate to have to play Alabama right now because Alabama looks good. They just do. They're a good team, okay? But obviously, Alabama and LSU, I'm going to put them together here. We're going to find out which one of these teams is the better one, obviously, when they play each other coming up. Now, that game will be in Tuscaloosa this year, which makes it a little bit tougher for LSU because, obviously, both of those stadiums are great environments. Bryant-Denny Stadium, Tiger Stadium there. The Alabama fans, I mean, that stadium is full every game, and so is LSU. Now, Bryant-Denny Stadium is not always full at the end of the game, but it is full at the beginning, unless they're playing like Southern Miss, and it's 1,000 degrees in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which it can get really hot there. If you go on a campus tour to Alabama, you'll find that out very quick because there's not a ton of breeze. There's a decent amount. Very similar to Raleigh. If you live on the coast in North Carolina, when it gets warm, as long as you're breezy, you're all right. But when you get into Raleigh, the heat can just get right impressed upon you, and you don't want that. Tuscaloosa is the same way. And as I said earlier, you go on a campus tour, you'll find that out real quick. And same thing for LSU. LSU's we're gonna find out what LSU is truly made out of. We've already seen a glimpse of what LSU is truly made out of in their win over Florida, which is a better team than I thought they were going to be. But we're gonna find out the full show of LSU. We're going to find out really what LSU is all about when they play Alabama, because they should not need any more motivation to play Alabama in that game. As I said earlier, they have lost to Alabama ever since Jack and Jill cracked corn. Okay, they haven't beaten Alabama in forever, and so this could be the year for them. Last year we said this was the year, but this year LSU has a much better defense, or much better offense. That could be the first Alabama LSU game in 10 plus years where the over under actually might be surpassed. I mean, the over under for that game will be through the roof, because Alabama's defense isn't phenomenal right now. It's definitely not the stereotypical Nick Saban defense, and the LSU defense, the same thing can be said about them. They have not been that impressive, and that game has the makings of a big time shootout where it could go down to whoever has the ball last could win that game. But we'll talk about that whenever that game gets closer. Now, last two teams, we've got Clemson and Ohio State. I will talk about Clemson first, then I will conclude with Ohio State, and then we'll talk about just in general what we can take from this week. Okay, so Clemson in general, I try not to take too much time on this because I know y'all are fans are a lot different, a lot of other teams. So I'll try not to take too long on this and use my my homerism for that. So Clemson as a whole looked better. This is undeniable. Clemson looked a lot better this week, and that was a good sight to see, obviously coming off the bye week, which history has told us has played in Clemson's favor. That's what you wanted to see. The first three drives, Clemson scoring a touchdown on two of the three, kind of punching Florida State in the mouth, was a good sight to see. That was something that needed to happen, and Clemson looked good. Everyone looked in sync pretty much, and that's what you want to see. The offensive line still has a couple of problems with the false starts and things of that nature, but overall, Clemson looked like a better team. Okay, the defense is still really, really good. Yes, I know they gave up 14 to Florida State. Yes, I know Florida State's offense is absolutely abysmal. But you have to remember, Clemson was playing freshmen in midway through the third quarter. Like, all freshmen were on the field, maybe with one senior who was a linebacker trying to guide the defense as the middle linebacker, as we know. For those of you in football, I don't know how many people or how many listeners I have that are actually football players, but if you are a football player, you would know that the middle linebacker is kind of the quarterback of the defense. He's trying to get everyone set up. And if we're going to look at a pro football analogy, if you ever watch Luke Kuechly for the Carolina Panthers, he's always making signals around and communicating to the cornerbacks and the safeties and the DBs and the defensive linemen, telling them, here's what we're doing. They're audibling. We're going to make an audible. We're going to make an adjustment. We're going to try to stop the run here, or we're going to try to stop the pass wherever that's going to come, whether it's going to come across the middle or the deep cross. Either way, NFL has more of a conservative offense, and then sometimes they take deep shots. But that's beside the point. Luke Kuechly is always moving around and calling out signs and things of that nature. So the defense is still very, very good. They are. And when Clemson, we got a glimpse of this. We got a glimpse of how good Clemson could actually be this weekend. And when Clemson plays 60 minutes like they're in their best, like the team they can play, they are the best team in the country. Regardless, I don't care what anyone says. When Clemson shows it, when we actually show that we are the best team in the country and we play like that, we are the best team in the country. No one can beat us. No chance. And that has been shown last year by last year's national championship game. We got a glimpse of what we could be, obviously, with Trevor Lawrence having a really, really solid first half, a great first half comparative to his standard, and T. Higgins and Justin Ross, finally getting Justin Ross involved, which is a good sight to see. Obviously, T. Higgins had been the main focus this year to start out the year, and everyone had thought about Justin Ross being like this amazing wide receiver, which he is a great receiver, but I feel like he was underutilized in the first part of the season. That's crazy to say, the first part of the season. We're six games through, and it feels like this season has flown by. But it has, and that's college football for you, and that's why the sport's so great, because every game in college football, and this cannot be said for any other league, the NBA plays 82 games. Who cares if you lose one? The NFL plays 17 games. You can lose 5 or 6 and still make the playoff, okay, or the playoffs. Not to be confused with the playoff, which is in college football. Baseball, 162 games. Who cares? It's 162 games. I could lose 40 games. Think, for those of you who play sports, imagine you going into a season and saying, I could lose 40 games and still win the World Series. How crazy that sounds? 162 games. That's just ridiculous. We don't need 162 game season in baseball. Yes, I know baseball's attendance is decent when it gets colder. But let's be real here. Do they need to be playing every single day in the middle of July? Come on now. They don't need to be doing that. It's hot outside. It's hot, okay? Yes, I know some baseball teams play in a dome and things of that nature, but come on. They don't need to be playing 162 games, but again, that's off topic, okay? Now, I'm going to touch on a team real quick. I'm going to touch on Wake Forest. Wake Forest was ranked 19. They were undefeated, and everyone was like, holy crap, Wake Forest could be undefeated by the time they come down to Death Valley on November 16th and play Clemson. Yeah, but you forget, it's Wake Forest, and this is Wake Forest for you, okay? So they lost to Louisville, and the problem with this for Clemson is, if Clemson was looking for a resume booster, it was going to be Wake Forest. Because if they had been ranked during that time, probably top 15 if they went out, Clemson could say, well, we got a top 15 win right here. That's a marquee win, and we'll rise in the playoff rankings depending on whatever happened in the other for the other teams. But still, that would be a good win for Clemson to have had they beaten a ranked, undefeated Wake Forest team, which they should have. Clemson is better than Wake Forest in every way, shape, or form, and hasn't lost to Wake Forest in quite a long time. Not as long as Alabama beating LSU, I don't think, but maybe. It's still a very long time regardless. But that would have been a good win for Clemson. But now, because of Wake Forest losing to a decent Louisville team at best, more like a below average Louisville team, that opportunity is snatched away. But if Clemson wins out, which they should, they'll be fine regardless. And we'll talk about that later when we get down to the end of the football, when we get down to the end of college football season, probably around conference championship weekend, and I'll talk about what can happen if certain teams win on conference championship weekend. And then the last thing is Ohio State. Now, a lot of things I'm going to say about Ohio State are going to be the same things I said about Wisconsin. Ohio State has a chance to have a major turning point in their season. If they can beat Wisconsin at home, that would be a huge deal for Ohio State. That would be a propellant and say Ohio State is really for real, because they're going to go against probably the best defense they're going to play all season, including the postseason, in Wisconsin's defense. And if they can win that game by a convincible margin, Ohio State is the best team in the country. They will be ranked number one in the AP poll. And if they're not ranked number one in the AP poll, everyone who didn't vote for Ohio State is number one in their voting ballot should have their voting rights removed. That is ridiculous not to have Ohio State number one if they beat Wisconsin by a sizable margin. But here's the problem for Ohio State, and this is going to be a if or when statement. The question about Ohio State and the question surrounding Ohio State is, where is that game? Where is it? Is there one? Will there be one? And if so, what team has a possibility of collapsing Ohio State's season like teams have done in the past? I'm going to pull up Ohio State's schedule real quick, and I'm going to read you the rest of their schedule. And I'm going to go through it game by game, and we're going to talk about, could this be the game? And I'm not going to go super in depth here. I already know I'm closer to 40 minutes. Hopefully y'all are listening to this as you're going to school on a beautiful, hopefully a beautiful morning. I know we've gotten some rain here, which is a blessing. We needed the rain. So hopefully you're listening to this while you're driving, because it'll probably be a black screen on YouTube again. So as you look at Ohio State, they got to play at Northwestern, which is 1-4, and they're terrible. They get Wisconsin at home, as has been mentioned many times. Maryland, Rutgers, Penn State, Michigan. Okay. Penn State is number 7 in the country. I don't think Penn State will be number 7 by then. Maybe they will. They still get Penn State at home. But, just think about this. They got to play at Northwestern. Northwestern is awful. But could that be the game? Could it be the game? You can't. It's so hard to predict these games, because every team in college football usually wins one they shouldn't win or loses one they shouldn't lose. And they shouldn't lose that game. They're a better team than Northwestern across the board in every way, shape, and facet of the game. They're a better team. But could that be the one? Could it be the one they lose to Maryland? Maryland's still kind of searching for an identity. No one knows what Maryland's thinking right now. Maryland looks great some weeks and they look terrible the other weeks. So But could that be the game? That game's at home, which has typically favored Ohio State in the past, so we don't really know that. Rutgers is awful. They're not losing to Rutgers. If they lose to Rutgers, then something's really wrong with college football. I mean, the sky actually might be falling if they lose to Rutgers. They get Penn State at home, and then they got to play Michigan on the road. Michigan sucks. Don't tell me Michigan's going to beat Ohio State. That will never happen in a million years. They had a better chance to win last year. They didn't do it, and it's 100% on their it's 100% their fault that they did not beat Michigan last year, or that Michigan did not beat Ohio State last year. I know, Nick, if you're watching this, you probably didn't like that claim, but sometimes I got to be honest. Michigan has blown it this year. Michigan should be a better team. They've absolutely blown it. I mean, how the heck do you give up 24 points to Illinois? Illinois hasn't scored 24 points combined this season. How do you give up 24 points to Illinois? I don't get it. I think maybe 25. How do you give up 25 points to Illinois? I don't get it. Okay, but I mean, that's the challenge with Ohio State. You keep saying, where is the game? But where is the game? You don't know, because Ohio State's game that has usually stuck up on them has been to a terrible team. But when you look at the terrible team, you say, well, they're better. They're better than this team in every way, shape, or form, so you just don't know what to do. You don't know where to pick it. You don't know where it's coming. And so we have this dilemma. We don't know when it's going to come, and we don't know if it is going to come, because Ohio State has looked so great so far. So, we're just over 40 minutes here, so I'll be wrapping up the podcast. Now, I hope y'all enjoyed this podcast. I tried to make it a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more lively, because I know the last podcast kind of got boring with my very monotonous voice. So I tried to make sure I didn't have so much of a monotonous voice this week, and I hope I did a good job of that. I don't know if I did, but on the frequency coming through here, it definitely seems like the microphone has picked up a lot more of my voice, and it seems like my voice has been a lot louder. And I tried to use I might have gone on a couple of tangents that might have had a couple derivatives, I should say, which is the slope of a tangent line. Those derivatives may have been negative, downgrading the overall quality of the podcast. But then again, I mean, I'm not doing this for a living right now. I'm here to have fun and talk to people and talk to you guys on YouTube. So if y'all have any disagreements with me, have any questions, things of that nature, feel free to drop them in the comments below. I'll try to incorporate them into next week's podcast, and we will talk about them there. Anything else? I don't think I have anything else to talk about there. So I hope y'all have a good day, and I look forward to next podcast.